Today we will be looking at two horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On Saturday, November 20th, 1976, a scout leader was helping young boys navigate a tight passage in a local cave in Utah. This cave was popular with local scout groups and outdoor enthusiasts in the area. The cave featured passages that ranged from easy walking chambers to more challenging sections that required climbing, crawling, and careful navigation. On this particular Saturday in November, a large group had organized a trip. The expedition consisted of 14 varsity Boy Scouts plus several other youths, led by multiple adults including David Mitchell and Robert Jenkins, who was 39 years old. With more than 16 people total, this was a sizable group that would have needed careful coordination to keep everyone together and safe in the underground passages, and began making their way through the system, the adults leading and the boys following behind with their lights and equipment. They were excited about the adventure, moving through chambers and passages under the guidance of their experienced adult leaders who were teaching them proper caving techniques. At some point during their exploration, the group reached a junction in the cave where passages branched off in different directions. This is a common feature in cave systems, decision points where you have to choose which route to follow. Robert, along with some of the scouts, decided to explore one of the branches to see if it was the route they wanted to take deeper into the cave. Robert and the boys with him made their way down this branch passage for some distance, examining the route and trying to determine if it would lead them to the sections of the cave they wanted to explore. After progressing through the passage, Robert made the determination that this wasn't the right way. It was either leading to a dead end or taking them in the wrong direction from where they wanted to go. The group turned around and began retracing their steps back toward the junction, where the rest of their party was waiting. As they made their way back through the passage, they came to a section that required a climb down. A descent of approximately 6 to 8 feet, 1.8 to 2.4 meters, where the cave floor dropped to a lower level. This climb down wasn't a vertical drop. It was more of a steep descent that required using hands and feet to carefully lower yourself to the passage below. But the route to this lower level involved squeezing through a narrow opening, essentially a smooth, slick tunnel that was 6 to 7 feet long that acted as a chute between the upper and lower passages. Robert positioned himself to help the scouts navigate this descent. As the adult leader, he was responsible for making sure each boy got down safely, probably offering handholds, guidance, and support as they worked their way through the tight passage and down to the lower level. This was exactly the kind of leadership and assistance that scout leaders provide during caving trips. Several boys had already successfully made the descent with Robert's help. He was positioned at the top of the climb down, probably bracing himself to assist the next scout when something went wrong. Robert lost his grip on the rope and slipped on the smooth cave surface. In an instant, Robert found himself falling into the narrow tunnel that led to the climb down. The tunnel was smooth and slick from years of cavers passing through it, polished by countless hands and bodies sliding across the limestone surface. Robert's body slid into this chute, and the narrow passage immediately grabbed him in the worst possible orientation. Robert went into the tunnel hips first, his body wedging into the smooth, slick passage at an awkward angle. His legs were stretched wide and slightly apart, with his feet pointing back toward his face in an unnatural position. He was sliding through a polished stone tube with no way to arrest his descent. The tunnel was treacherous because it was just wide enough to allow a body to enter, but smooth enough that there were no protrusions or rough spots to grab onto. Robert's hands scrambled for purchase on the slick walls, but the polished limestone offered nothing to grip. He was accelerating through the chute, completely unable to control his slide. As Robert slid through the tunnel, the passage began to expand and widen. This expansion was the most dangerous part of the feature. The tunnel went from being narrow enough to provide some friction and control to being wide enough that Robert's body was no longer in contact with all the walls. He was now in free fall within the expanding passage. The acceleration combined with the awkward body position created a spinning motion. Robert's body began rotating as he fell, the angular momentum from his twisted entry into the tunnel now causing him to tumble through the air as he dropped toward the cave floor below. Robert shot out of the bottom of the tunnel into the open space of the lower passage. He was falling, spinning, completely, with no way to protect himself or control his landing. Robert's head struck the rocky cave floor first with tremendous force. His face hit the unforgiving limestone, his neck compressed under the impact of his full body weight, accelerated by the fall and focused on his skull and cervical spine. The sound of the impact echoed through the cave passage, a sickening crack that the boys watching heard clearly in the confined space. Robert's body continued its terrible rotation after his head struck, and his stomach slammed into the rocky floor immediately after. He landed in a crumpled heap on the cave floor. The boys who had witnessed Robert's fall immediately began yelling for help. They had just watched their adult leader, the man who was supposed to be keeping them safe, fall headfirst through a tunnel and land with devastating force on the cave floor. They knew instinctively that something terrible had happened. David Mitchell, the other adult leader, heard the boys' desperate calls for help and rushed through the cave passages toward the scene. When he reached the climb-down area and saw Robert lying on the cave floor below, he immediately understood the severity of the situation. Mitchell quickly descended to where Robert lay and assessed his condition. Robert was unconscious and bleeding from his head, clear signs of serious trauma from the impact with the cave floor. The head wound was significant, blood flowing from where Robert's skull had struck the limestone. As Mitchell examined Robert, the situation became even more critical. Robert stopped breathing. The head trauma had been so severe that his respiratory system had shut down. Without immediate intervention, Robert would die within minutes. Mitchell immediately began CPR, starting chest compressions to manually circulate Robert's blood and rescue breathing to force air into his lungs. He continued performing CPR on Robert minute after minute, trying desperately to keep blood flowing to Robert's brain and oxygen circulating through his body. The boys watched as their remaining adult leader fought to save Robert's life, performing continuous chest compressions and rescue breaths in the cramped cave passage. Another adult in the group made the decision to exit the cave and get professional help. He navigated back through the passages toward the entrance. Mitchell continued CPR for more than an hour. His arms were burning from the exertion. His own breathing labored from the physical effort, but he kept going. He compressed Robert's chest over and over, trying to manually pump blood through a cardiovascular system that had stopped working on its own. He breathed into Robert's lungs, trying to force oxygen into tissue that desperately needed it. The Cache County Sheriff's Office responded to the emergency call, along with medical personnel. They gathered their equipment and made their way towards the accident, navigating through the passages toward the location where Robert lay injured, and Mitchell continued performing CPR. When the emergency responders reached the scene, they took over from Mitchell, who had been performing CPR continuously for over an hour, an extraordinary feat of physical endurance and dedication. The medical personnel examined Robert, assessed his injuries, and attempted their own resuscitation efforts using their advanced equipment and training. But despite everything Mitchell had done, despite the rapid response of emergency services, despite the best efforts of trained medical personnel, there was nothing they could do to save Robert. The head trauma from landing face first on the cave floor after spinning through the slick tunnel had been catastrophic. The impact had caused injuries that were simply not survivable. Robert was pronounced dead in the cave. The 39-year-old scout leader who had been helping boys navigate a challenging passage had died in front of the children he was trying to protect and guide. The boys who had been on this cave trip as an exciting outdoor adventure were now witnesses to a fatal accident that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. 2 hours after Robert had slipped and fallen through that smooth tunnel, his body was carried out of the cave and brought to the surface. The scout trip that had begun as an educational adventure had ended in tragedy, and a family had lost a husband, father, or brother who had died trying to keep young scouts safe underground. On April 24, 1993, a 7-year-old boy was playing in his yard in New Jersey along with his father. This particular property was a typical residential yard in New Jersey. Grass, some trees, the kind of outdoor space where families let their children play without a second thought about safety. What nobody knew was that underground, tree stumps and other organic debris had been slowly decomposing over time. As tree roots rot and break down, they leave empty spaces in the soil. When these voids combine with natural erosion and water movement underground, they can create hidden caverns or chambers beneath what appears to be solid ground. On this particular April day, the 7-year-old boy was outside playing in the yard. He was doing what 7-year-olds do, running around, burning off energy, enjoying the spring weather. His father was nearby, watching his son play, making sure the boy didn't wander too far or get into mischief. The boy was running across a section of the yard that looked completely normal. The grass was growing, the ground appeared solid, and there was no indication whatsoever that anything was wrong beneath the surface. He had run across this exact same spot dozens or even hundreds of times before without incident. But this time, something was different. The underground void that had been forming beneath the yard had finally compromised the structural integrity of the soil above it. The thin layer of earth and roots that had been spanning the cavity had weakened to the critical point where it could no longer support weight. As the boy ran across this spot, his weight was just enough to trigger a catastrophic collapse. The ground beneath his feet suddenly gave way, opening up like a trap door. One moment, the boy was running on solid ground, and the next moment, there was a gaping hole, just barely big enough to suck him in where the surface had been. The father saw his son suddenly drop as the ground collapsed. The boy didn't have time to react or jump clear. The collapse happened too quickly. He fell straight down into the opening, gripping onto rocks to stop the fall. The father's immediate reaction was pure instinct. He rushed to the hole and looked down into the darkness, seeing his son below the surface. The father reached down into the opening, trying desperately to grab his son and pull him back up to safety. His hands found his son's arms or clothing, and he pulled with all his strength, trying to extract the boy from the hole. But the situation was more complex and dangerous than it initially appeared. The collapse wasn't just a simple straight-down drop into a hole. The underground void was larger than the surface opening, and the collapsing soil was creating a funnel effect, pulling the boy deeper into the cavity. The loose earth and debris around the edges of the hole were also unstable, threatening to collapse further and potentially trap both father and son. The father pulled harder, his muscles straining as he tried to haul his son back up through the opening. But despite his desperate efforts, he couldn't get enough leverage or grip to extract the boy. The angle was wrong since it was such a narrow opening. Only 1 or 2 angles could have brought him out, or maybe none. The father found himself in every parent's worst nightmare, watching his child in immediate danger and being physically unable to save him. The boy slipped from his grasp and fell deeper into the underground void. The father watched helplessly as his son disappeared further down into the cavity, sliding or falling beyond his reach into the darkness below the surface. Then came the horrific thud sound. Shivers went down the father's spine as he heard the sound of the fall. The father shouted down into the hole, calling his son's name, trying to maintain contact with him. And remarkably, terrifyingly, the boy responded. His voice came up from below ground, frightened, probably crying, but alive and conscious. The boy was trapped in some kind of underground chamber or cavern, 8 feet below where the surface had been, but he was breathing and able to communicate. This moment of voice contact must have given the father a surge of hope mixed with terror. The father immediately called for emergency services. He explained the situation. His son had fallen through a collapsed section of ground and was trapped in an underground void, still alive and conscious but unreachable without help. The call went out to local emergency responders, and multiple agencies began mobilizing for what would become a complex and desperate rescue operation. Emergency vehicles began arriving at the property: fire trucks, police cars, ambulances, and specialized rescue equipment. The responders quickly assessed the situation and understood the extreme danger. They had a child trapped underground in an unstable cavity, with no clear understanding of how large the void was. how stable the surrounding ground might be, or what condition the boy was in, beyond the fact that he could still speak. The rescuers faced a terrible dilemma. They needed to reach the boy as quickly as possible, but rushing in without proper precautions could trigger further collapse that would bury the child completely, or trap the rescuers as well. The rescue team began the painstaking process of excavating around the collapse site. They brought in shovels and started carefully removing earth, trying to widen the opening and create a path down to where the boy was trapped. Every shovelful of dirt had to be removed carefully to avoid triggering additional collapse. Throughout this process, rescuers maintained voice contact with the boy. They called down to him, asking him questions, telling him help was coming, trying to keep him calm and aware. He was scared, brutally injured from the fall, and certainly traumatized by being trapped in darkness below ground, but he was still conscious and able to communicate. As the digging continued, the rescuers began to understand the nature of the underground void. It wasn't a natural cave or a simple hole. It was what they described as an underground cavern formed by tree stumps and other organic debris. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. The rescue operation stretched from 1 hour to 2, then 3, then 4. The rescuers worked in shifts, digging carefully, removing buckets of earth, shoring up the sides of their excavation with whatever materials they could find. All the while, they maintained voice contact with the boy, reassuring him, encouraging him to stay calm, telling him they were getting closer. But as the hours continued to pass, something changed. The boy's responses became less frequent, less clear. His voice, which had been frightened but responsive, began to fade. The rescuers called down more urgently, trying to keep him engaged, trying to keep him conscious and alert. The boy's answers became weaker, harder to hear. The underground environment where the boy was trapped was hostile to human survival. The air quality in the confined space was poor, with limited oxygen and potentially dangerous concentrations of carbon dioxide building up from his own breathing. The temperature was cool, and the boy was probably suffering from shock and hypothermia. His injuries from the initial fall were unknown, but potentially serious, and the psychological trauma of being trapped alone in darkness underground was overwhelming. The rescue teams redoubled their efforts, digging faster, but trying to maintain safety protocols. They knew they were running out of time. The boy's responses had become so weak and infrequent that they feared he was losing consciousness. They called down constantly, but the responses grew fainter and then stopped altogether. After 7 hours of continuous digging, 7 hours of desperate excavation work, of calling down into the void, of hoping against hope, the rescue teams finally broke through to the underground chamber where the boy was trapped. They reached into the cavity and found the small body of the 7-year-old child who had fallen through his own yard that morning. But they were too late. The boy was dead. Whether he had died from injuries sustained in the fall, from suffocation in the poor air quality of the underground chamber, from hypothermia and shock, or from some combination of all these factors, the result was the same. The 7-year-old who had been running and playing in his yard that morning was gone. The rescuers carefully extracted the boy's body from the underground cavern and brought him to the surface. The father, who had been maintaining desperate hope throughout the 7-hour nightmare, had to face the devastating reality that his son had died, trapped beneath the ground, where he should have been safe to play. Dangers can lurk beneath the most ordinary seeming places, and sometimes even the most heroic rescue efforts arrive too late to save a child from the hidden voids beneath our feet.